Sorry about that. I want to point out to you right here, this is the floor in a church near Capernaum. And this is the Tagba church. This is where you can see the two fish and a basket. Well, this is, they think, is where Jesus fed 5,000 people. This is that church in January of 2017. Christianity is a historical religion. It's founded not on abstract ideas, but on real events in actual history. And the most important player of the happenings are of this Jewish carpenter named Jesus. So up here in the right-hand corner is around Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is there, beyond that little knoll. This is inside Bethlehem. This is the streets of Bethlehem. This is just outside of Jericho. Here's Jericho in the map, and Jerusalem. They're about 11 miles apart. It's a huge difference. Bethlehem is just south of Jerusalem. And then this is in the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. These are olive trees. So just to point out, there's a real historical setting. People live and breathe in these areas still today. And they did certainly at Jesus' time. We're going to look at a few of these things and what happened here. I would like to point out there are some different literary forms in the New Testament. First of all, we're looking at the Gospels specifically. This is a Greek word on the right, euangelion. This means good news, or the Gospels. That's what the Gospels are. They are good news. It's good news. It's not bad news. It's not about legalism. It's about being free. It's not about legalism. It's about having legalism taken care of by Jesus himself. And we'll look at some of this. But different forms of the good news. We're looking at a synoptic, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are very similar. Synoptic is like the same. They have similar features. They're not exactly alike, but they are very similar. And then in all of them, there are some parables. There are about 40 different parables that Jesus teaches from and uses those to carry on some great information. They're basically just earthly stories with a heavenly message. If I were to ask you what a parable is, that's what I'm looking for. There's simple earthly stories with some sort of spiritual meaning, heavenly message involved in them. And Jesus makes them stick because they hang around in your mind. You remember these stories. Then he does just preach some straightforward sermons based on different texts or different topics. And we find those throughout the New Testament, especially in the Gospels. There's narrative. Okay, this happened this day, and then they went here, and then they did that. It's just the events that are going on, and those are found quite frequently in the Gospels. You don't find those near as much in the epistles, but we do have a lot of narrative in these 4 Gospels, not just the Synoptics, but in all 4, including John. And then they are steeped in history. There's a cultural history going on from the idea of Israel and Judaism, a religious history in the sense of Judaism. There's a cultural and political history from the Roman perspective and Hellenism that was seeded back from Alexander the Great some 300 years before this. So there's a lot of history going on and that's involved and that is pertinent to this study and the goings on at the very time. You know, as Augustus Caesar wrote a census or asked that everyone take a census, that sort of thing happening. And Pilate was the governor and Herod was the king and so on. There were particular synagogue rulers like Jairus spoken about in Luke. And so there's some very important differences in the forms and what's going on with the story. There's an interpretive element. especially in the Gospel of John. And I think this happens because John wrote so much later than the other Gospels. Some probably 40 years later, if not maybe even 50. So at that point, John is thinking through some of the events. Some of the events are exactly the same as others. Now, there's not a lot of particular little events that are similar in all four Gospels. In fact, there are only two basic things that happen in all four Gospels. One is the feeding of the 5,000, and the other is the death, burial, and resurrection event. Now you can break that down and make several out of it, but for the most part, those are the only two things. But John is more interpretive than the other gospel writers. And it's all about, yes, you got it. It is all about Jesus. Jesus' life and teachings begin in these books in this way. And Matthew, we find out the beginning of it is really a list of people. It's supposedly his genealogy. Jesus' teachings, though, don't really start until chapter 4, after he's baptized in chapter 3 in Matthew. In Mark, it skips his baptism. It mentions John the Baptist, but it jumps right into his preaching. In Luke, we open with Luke's little opening as an author, as a research journalist, and then it gives it a little background of Elizabeth and Zechariah, John the Baptist's parents, and then Jesus' parents, Joseph and Mary. And then it goes to his baptism, similar to Matthew. And then both in Matthew and Luke, chapter 4, we open with the temptations, the three temptations that the devil takes Jesus on. John doesn't have any of those things, except for the idea. He does mention the baptism of Jesus, but he doesn't talk about the baptism event. He does talk about John the Baptist and mention him, but it is a little bit different than the others, but they're similar. And then it goes into some events and miracle workings of Jesus in chapter 2, teachings in chapter 3, and then just some more narrative and teaching in chapter 4 of John. John the Baptist is talked about, not to be confused with John, the author of the Gospel of John. But John the Baptist is talked more about in Luke than the others. However, he is mentioned in all four. In the picture below, you see me and a girl named Tabitha. We were in the Jordan River. Some think that maybe this is where Jesus was baptized. You can see there is not much to the Jordan River. It doesn't flow heavily. It's not flowing a lot. And this is also in January, that we were actually there on Sunday, January the 8th. But and it's cool. I mean, the water is actually probably 50 degrees. Temperature outside is 65. But you can see it's small, so who knows? It may have been flowing heavier back in Jesus' day. I can't say, but that's what it looks like in 2017. The emphasis on the meaning behind the text is a little bit different. And what I want to do with this slide is just point out to you the differences in these different gospel writers. Luke gives a little bit of commentary just at the very opening. The rest of it is just straightforward narrative and sermons and parables and such. He doesn't make comment. However, throughout the book of John and in the end, 2 times, John makes comment about the writing, about the world can't contain the books, and why Jesus came. You ought to read this because it's here to lead you to salvation. It's here to lead you to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. You don't find that in the other ones. It interprets itself as you go along. You don't find those in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke so much. But they all do present Jesus in a different way. One presents Jesus more as a Messiah, not that all of them others don't. We certainly see that in Matthew. Jesus is seen as a healer and a doer, and immediately they did something in the Gospel of Mark. The Son of God, he is the Son of God in all of them. Mark, Matthew may say the Son of Man. In John, it's certainly the Son of God, Son of Man in Luke. In John, he says 30 times, Jesus says, that he was sent from God, or sent from heaven, sent from his Father. And in all of these, he has a special and unique relationship with God the Father that is in heaven. Jesus clearly talks about that in each of the four Gospels. In one Gospel, maybe he's more of a human. The other Gospel, maybe he's more divine. In one Gospel, maybe he's more of a social worker. In another Gospel, he's more of a teacher or an instructor. Yet he's all of these in each of the Gospels at some point. So I just want to point out the similarities and differences through these slides. The next one here is his self-proclaimed purpose. Some of them are pretty challenging because Jesus sounds like he contradicts himself a little bit. I came to fulfill the law and the prophets. We find in Matthew that the Old Testament, the fulfillment of the prophets, is realized and mentioned quite a bit. Jesus has authority to forgive sins. He mentioned that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I did not come to bring peace, but I came to bring a sword. And that's a little disconcerting for some people, but Jesus said those words. I came to seek and save the lost, one of my favorite passages, 19:10 of Luke. And in chapter 10 of John, he says, I came to give life and life more abundantly. Jesus came, or he was sent. He says those two things a lot in the book of John. But his purpose, and he made it clear to his apostles, my purpose is I'm going to suffer and I'm going to be mutilated. He doesn't say that, but he says I'm going to be beat. I'm going to suffer by the hands of the elders and the leaders of Judaism, be betrayed, and I'm going to be killed, and then I'm going to raise the third day. He says this in all of the Gospels. And again, another one from Matthew, one of my favorite, is from chapter 20, verse 28. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus came as a ransom, and he said that. He recognized what he came for, and that's an important part. Don't know why I have Matthew 24:30 there, so we'll skip it. Here's a map. It's a map that I would like you to get familiar with. It's a squiggly line between the two seas, the Sea of Galilee at the north and the Dead Sea on the south. To the tip of the top of the Dead Sea is Jerusalem. The tip of the bottom of the Sea of Galilee is Nazareth, about similar distance from each. It's just good to be able to note. If you see maps, you'll kind of know where you are, and you need to know where this is in the location of the Mediterranean Sea. It's on the far east end of the Mediterranean. It's an important map to just get a handle of for all of the Bible, especially the New Testament Gospels. Here's a similar map. You see the Dead Sea to the right here in the bottom, right here. And then the Sea of Galilee clear up here. And so Jerusalem would be there. Right here would be Jericho at the base of this mountain. You see the ridge of the mount, this mountain ridge all the way up there. This is 1,500 feet below sea level here to 2,800 feet above sea level here, and going over a ridge. There's a lot of difference. 3,000 feet difference in just 11 miles. There is not 3,000 feet difference between Parsons, Kansas, and the very far west end of the state of Kansas. Or maybe there is just 3,000 feet difference. And that's 400 miles, folks. This little distance right here is 11 miles at the base of the mountain to here lengthwise, and it's almost a mile difference height-wise. It's a very steep climb. And I can't emphasize how important that is to know. Jerusalem is one of the highest capitals in all of the world at nearly 3,000 feet high. Obviously Denver, Colorado, but it's not a capital of a nation. Okay, there's some good cities and locations to be familiar with, but these are the current names, not the biblical names. I just wanted you to see the height difference in this map. Okay, I would like to turn to the harmony of the Gospels. Now, we don't talk about it in the book, in Ehrman's book. I don't know if he even mentions a harmony. He probably does, but the important thing is that you understand what one is and why they are used. What they do is take each of the Gospels, line them up side by side, and show them the different topics and the different series of events on the far left, and then where they are in the different Gospels. What we have on this page is several different events not found in any of the other Gospels. They're either in Matthew, in Luke, or in John. So we'll go to the next slide. And in this slide, you see the same type of harmony. And so you have Jesus heals a faithful leper in 3 of these passages, not found in John. Jesus heals the centurion's servant in John, Luke, and in Matthew, but not in Mark. Again, why the synoptics? You can see vividly here why the synoptics are called that. They're very similar. They do all of these same events, but yet John is lacking. So you can see why you can call these similar, or the synoptic writings. And continued on in the same line of thought. I don't particularly like this slide. I don't think this rejection in Nazareth is the same as these, but nonetheless, people do use that. So there are going to be differences in different way people line up a harmony. So so you can see here the feeding of the 5,000 is one of the few events of all of the New Testament that all 4 gospel writers have in them. And then you see that too. And in the next slide, we have the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and show who their readers were. They were sent to different kinds of people, and then the original readers are different for each one, as Jesus is presented as a different kind of person in each of the Gospels. So you can see that up above. The styles are different, so you see the different styles in the different Gospel writers, and you have a different emphasis, and that's why we have these charts. And then here's just another chart of the different Gospel harmony of the Gospel. And so the event of his death, burial, and resurrection is seen where all 4 Gospels have the same material. And you can see that here, and you can break it down and say there's more than 2 events, but that's why I said it in that way. And then here's another slide just to give you a feel for the harmony. I think they're important. And there's a lot of comparisons of the different parables. And so here are some parables you see from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We don't find them so much in John. Some people do call John chapter 10 a parable, but it's not seen that way for most. And then there's just a few more here. The ones that really stand out are the ones found in Luke, in my mind, from Luke 10 and Luke 15, the prodigal son, and then the parable of the Good Samaritan. The sheep and goats is also a great one found in Matthew 25. And then similarities of the Gospels are found, and there's a lot of them. I just want to point out that all of the Gospels have the similarities of his political context. It's in the same setting geographically. It talks about some of the same people, John the Baptist and Jesus, his family and disciples. It's not like John uses a different family and Jesus, or rather Luke and Matthew, use yet a different one, and so on. They're all very consistent and very coherent. Even the different writers talk about Jesus as a title in a different way, or all the same way rather, than in a different way. Jesus uses a Hebrew Bible throughout, and what I mean by that is that his Bible is a very important part. In Matthew, in Mark, Luke, and John, it shows that he fulfills prophecies, he quotes from it, and he teaches from it. Talks about Isaiah and talks about the Torah. And when he does, he uses the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. I think that's important to know, that the similarities of these Gospels far outweigh the differences. Look at the next part of this list. There are 20 different things that are similar to, and I have the Bible on there twice, so I'll have to correct the slide. But they're miracles, some of the same, some different, but the same style of person you find in Jesus. Now, certainly the style of writing is different in each of the Gospels, which would stand to reason since they are written by different people. And the last couple things I want to point out are two words that aren't from English, but kerygma is Greek. It's a proclamation. It's a preaching. That's essential to the gospel. It's the seed, or the very core of the gospel is called the kerygma. And then verisimilitude is Latin, but similar, and like a very similar, even though I don't think that's what it is. It's not very, but it's a consistent theme throughout. In literature, they talk about verisimilitude, and they want to make it believable, because you're writing a fictional book. The Bible isn't fiction. The New Testament is not fiction, but there is a sense of verisimilitude to it, because the same kind of people, and there's the themes from the Genesis through Revelation, the same themes from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and the book of Revelation, and Paul's writings. And God's expectations are similar, and so on. So there is a similar and consistent flow of topics and themes throughout Scripture. And that's what we're looking at in verisimilitude in the Bible, even when they're written by different authors throughout. Lastly, I just want to point out some different forms of criticism types you may have known and see. We had the canonical criticism. They're talking about, which one should be in the canon. Pretty much was all finished. It was all finished by AD 400, because that's when Jerome copied it and translated it. And everyone has accepted it since then, and probably even 100 years before that, if not 200 years before that. Historical criticism is still a thing. We're looking at the New Testament historically, and we're looking at the form. What kind of ways are they presenting the message? So the New Testament as a whole is criticized and or studied analytically from different types of criticism, and you recognize some of these because we've gone over some of them, the different stories and what we can redact from, where they get their information from, and are they similar or not. The source criticism that these people used with Q or Luke manuscript, or a Matthew one. And then there's rhetorical and certainly rhetoric. You can use psychological and other kinds of criticism to study the New Testament. Sociological studies are important. And then there's postmodernism, and there's even, you laugh at this, a queer theory and feminist theory, and there's more. But for what it's worth, I just want to introduce you to these ideas, and some of them more so than others. They are an analysis from different perspectives. That's what these criticisms are. Yes, they criticize the Bible, but no, they aren't. They're being critical to understand it better in a different kind of perspective. John and the clearing of the temple, this is where the lineup of the harmony would be different, because in John chapter 2 it looks like this is at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and then in Matthew, what is it, chapter 26 or so, it's in the end of his ministry. But you can see that the clearing of the temple, when Jesus cleared this out, the people were probably selling around here. We don't know where they were exactly, but I want to let you know this is a huge temple mound of 36 acres, and they're probably selling these sheep and goats closer to the temple, so I don't have to go very far, because they're hauling them up here, burning them here, and then they're hauling out the remains outside of the camp. So that's what they're doing with it. But the clearing of the temple is an issue for some, and where does it stand? So we see 4 different portraits, and we're about done with the Gospels, and we'll carry on with the whole of the New Testament. I hope you enjoy this video, and I look forward to sharing with you some more. We'll talk to you soon.